In an unprecedented escalation that has rewritten the rules of international trade warfare, Canada and the European Union have not restricted, not fined, not audited, but outright banned Elon Musk's Starlink from operating within their territories. The order is stark: cease all operations within 90 days. No appeals, no grace period for compliance. Two of America's oldest and most technologically integrated allies have just looked at the most advanced satellite internet constellation ever launched, serving over 4 million subscribers across 37 countries, and told it to leave. The official reason is not a technical one. There are no new findings about orbital debris, no surprise spectrum interference reports, no sudden safety concerns about satellite re-entry. The reason is Donald Trump's tariffs. The same tariffs that were sold to the American public as leverage to force Canada and Europe to the negotiating table have now done something no counter-tariff or trade barrier could have accomplished. They have triggered the removal of a flagship American company from allied markets, targeting not just any firm, but the one owned by the president's most visible business ally. The weapon President Trump aimed at allied economies ricocheted and struck the man standing next to him. Let's go through the timeline, because the coordination between Ottawa and Brussels tells you everything about how this was planned long before the public announcement. This was not a spontaneous reaction. This was a dormant strategy waiting for the right moment, and the latest round of U.S. tariff escalations provided that moment. At 9 a.m. Eastern Time, Canada's Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry stepped before cameras in Ottawa and announced that Starlink spectrum licenses were being revoked under Section 5 of the Radio Communication Act. Spectrum licenses in Canada have never been property rights. They are permissions granted at the government's discretion, revocable when the public interest demands it. The trigger language cited a fundamental reassessment of Canada's strategic communications infrastructure in light of ongoing economic hostilities with the United States. Canada did not seize anything that belonged to Elon Musk. It withdrew something that had always belonged to Canada: the right to use Canadian radio frequencies. Just 3 hours later, the European Commission announced a coordinated action across all 27 member states. The legal mechanism differed. The EU invoked its new digital sovereignty framework, a regulation passed 18 months ago, with language deliberately broad enough for this exact scenario. But the effect was identical. Starlink's ground station operating permits were suspended. Its data routing authorizations, the permissions allowing European user data to transit through ground stations, including those on U.S. soil, were revoked on data sovereignty grounds, and its spectrum coordination agreements with national regulators were terminated. The EU's announcement contained a single sentence that has since become the most dangerous precedent for American tech: a formal determination that satellite communications infrastructure, operated by entities subject to the jurisdiction of governments engaged in coercive trade practices against the European Union, constitutes a strategic vulnerability incompatible with European digital sovereignty. That dense bureaucratic clause applies not just to Starlink, but to every American technology company that operates in Europe on European regulatory permission. Elon Musk's response came within the hour. He posted on his own social media platform that the bans were illegal, politically motivated, and an attack on free speech. He tagged both Prime Minister Mark Carney and the European Commission President, writing, "You're banning the internet. History will judge you." He announced that Starlink's legal team would challenge both bans in every available jurisdiction. That response was exactly the wrong move, because the bans were never about the internet, free speech, or connectivity. They were about spectrum licenses, ground station permits, and data routing authorizations, government permissions that host governments have the sovereign right to grant, condition, and revoke. Musk argued as though his property had been stolen. The governments acted as though they had declined to renew a lease. Legally, the governments are correct, and by framing the ban as an attack on global connectivity, Musk made it politically easier for Ottawa and Brussels to hold their position. Now, why Starlink? Of all the American companies operating in Canada and Europe, the cloud providers, social media platforms, financial institutions, defense contractors, pharmaceutical giants, why was Elon Musk's satellite internet service the first target? The answer is a masterclass in strategic vulnerability. Starlink is the most regulatorily exposed major American company on Earth. Consider what it needs to operate in any given country: spectrum licenses to use specific radio frequencies, ground station permits for physical infrastructure, data routing, authorizations for cross-border transmission, and orbital coordination agreements with national regulators. Every single one of these is a permission, not a right. Every single one is granted by a government, and every single one can be withdrawn for any reason falling within that government's regulatory authority. Canada and Europe just demonstrated that economic conflict with the United States qualifies as such a reason. The strategic genius of choosing Starlink is that the ban costs the banning countries almost nothing. When a country imposes counter tariffs on American goods, it raises prices for its own consumers. Both sides bleed. When a country bans Starlink, it loses a satellite internet service that serves a relatively small subscriber base compared to terrestrial broadband. Most Canadian and European citizens do not use Starlink. Those who do can be migrated to alternative services or domestic programs currently under development. The pain is radically asymmetric. Starlink loses entire national markets representing billions in current and future revenue, while Canada and Europe lose almost nothing. And there is a political dimension that cannot be ignored. Elon Musk is not just the CEO of Starlink's parent company. He is the most publicly visible business ally of the Trump administration. He has appeared at White House events, publicly supported the president's trade policies, and used his platform to amplify administration messaging. Banning Starlink does not merely punish an American company. It punishes the specific American billionaire who has most publicly aligned himself with the policies that prompted retaliation. The message to every American business leader is unmistakable. Political proximity to this administration is not a shield, it is a target. The closer you stand to the president, the more attractive your company becomes as a vehicle for retaliation. But here's what makes this different from every previous trade retaliation in modern history. Canada and Europe did not just ban Starlink, they replaced it, and the replacement is what makes this ban permanent. Not a temporary pressure tactic, but a structural shift that cannot be reversed even if the tariffs are removed and political relations repaired. Canada announced simultaneously with the ban a sovereign satellite communications initiative, a $2.40 billion program to deploy a Canadian-owned and Canadian-operated low-Earth orbit satellite constellation, providing broadband coverage across Canadian territory, including the northern and rural communities that Starlink had been serving. The program will be built by Canadian aerospace companies using Canadian and European components, financed by government investment and private capital, and operational within 5 years. The design specifications are explicitly modeled on Starlink's architecture. Same low-Earth orbit approach, same mesh networking topology, same user terminal concept, but with one critical difference. The entire system, from satellites to ground stations to data routing, will be owned and operated by Canadian entities under Canadian sovereignty, with no data transiting American infrastructure at any point. The European Union went further. The Starlink ban was announced alongside an acceleration of Iris Quadri, the EU's planned sovereign satellite constellation, which had been in development for 3 years but moving at the cautious pace typical of EU infrastructure programs. The ban compressed the timeline from 8 years to 4. An additional €11 billion was allocated from the European Defence and Space Fund. Contracts were fast-tracked with European aerospace companies, and the program's mandate was expanded from its original scope of government and military communications to include commercial broadband service, a direct, explicit, permanent replacement for Starlink's European market. The EU Commissioner for Space captured the strategic logic in one sentence. We will never again depend on a foreign company subject to a foreign government for infrastructure that carries our citizens' data and our nation's communication. These replacement programs transform the ban from punitive measure into irreversible structural shift. Even if every U.S. tariff were reversed tomorrow, even if Washington achieved the most comprehensive trade reconciliation in history, the sovereign satellite programs would continue. The argument for building them is no longer about trade retaliation. It is about the principle that critical communications infrastructure should not depend on foreign companies controlled by foreign governments that have demonstrated a willingness to use economic coercion against their own allies. That principle does not expire when the trade dispute ends. It becomes permanent policy. Now the contagion spreads. Within 72 hours of the ban, SpaceX's private valuation, which had been tracking toward a $200 billion threshold, was revised downward by analysts at every major investment bank. One analyst wrote that Starlink's growth story was built on international expansion, and international expansion requires international regulatory permission, and that permission just became the most unreliable input in the model. Elon Musk's personal net worth, substantially tied to SpaceX's valuation, dropped by an estimated $27 billion in the week following the ban, a number exceeding the GDP of more than half the world's nations. But the real earthquake hit Silicon Valley. Within 1 week, Amazon Web Services disclosed in a regulatory filing that it was assessing the stability of operating permissions in jurisdictions where trade tensions with the United States are elevated. Microsoft issued a statement affirming its commitment to data sovereignty and local regulatory compliance, language that legal analysts interpreted as preemptive positioning against potential similar actions. Google Cloud quietly accelerated its European data localization program, moving to store and process all European customer data exclusively on European soil, using European-operated infrastructure. A project originally planned for 2028, now compressed to 2026. Meta's European regulatory team was placed on emergency footing, with the company's chief legal officer personally contacting EU officials to distinguish Meta's regulatory posture from Musk's. The message across American tech was unanimous and urgent. Distance yourself from the administration's trade policies, demonstrate regulatory compliance, and pray your company is not next. The defense sector reacted with alarm that went beyond commercial calculation. Starlink provides satellite communications to the U.S. military, to NATO forces, and to allied militaries worldwide. The ban in Canada and Europe did not directly affect military contracts, which operate under separate government-to-government agreements, but it raised a question that defense planners had never been forced to confront. If allied nations are willing to ban American commercial satellite services from civilian markets, how long before they begin questioning their dependence on American satellite services for military communications? The Pentagon's chief information officer convened an emergency review of military communications dependencies on commercial satellite providers. One defense analyst noted that the military uses Starlink because it is the best technology available. But best available does not matter if your allies are building alternatives specifically designed to operate without American involvement. In 5 years, Canada and Europe will have sovereign constellations. In 10 years, those constellations will be offered to other allied militaries. The commercial ban is the leading edge of a military realignment. And then the international acceleration that Washington found most alarming. Japan's Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications announced a comprehensive review of foreign satellite communication services operating in Japanese territory. Language that did not name Starlink, but that everyone understood as a signal of potential similar action. South Korea's telecommunications regulator issued a parallel announcement. Australia's Department of Infrastructure held a classified briefing for cabinet ministers on the strategic implications of foreign-controlled communications infrastructure. A briefing that reportedly included a detailed analysis of the Canada-EU template and its applicability to the Australian market. India's Department of Telecommunications, which had been reviewing Starlink's market entry application for over 2 years, quietly suspended the review indefinitely. The template was spreading, not through coordination, but through imitation. Every allied government that watched Canada and Europe ban Starlink at negligible cost to themselves while inflicting catastrophic damage on an American company is now conducting the same internal calculation. Which American companies operating in our market are most dependent on our regulatory permission, and what would it cost us to revoke it? At home, political fractures deepened along unexpected fault lines. 3 Republican senators from states with major tech industry presence issued a joint statement calling for an immediate reassessment of trade policies that expose American technology companies, regulatory retaliation in allied markets. One of them said in an interview that the technology sector is the crown jewel of the American economy, and the suggestion that trade policy should be conducted without regard to the regulatory exposure of American companies in foreign markets is not just strategically unwise, but an act of self-sabotage. The Business Roundtable demanded an emergency meeting with the White House. The request was declined. The National Association of Manufacturers issued a statement calling the Starlink ban a direct and foreseeable consequence of trade policies that treat allies as adversaries, leaving American companies exposed to retaliation that the government cannot prevent and apparently did not anticipate. And then came the line that changed everything. At a joint press conference with the President of the European Commission, broadcast to every capital on Earth, Prime Minister Mark Carney spoke without notes, in the measured cadence of a former central banker who understands that the most devastating statements are the ones delivered without heat. He said, "Let me be clear about what has happened and why. The United States imposed tariffs on Canadian and European goods, tariffs designed to cause economic pain to our industries and our workers. We had a choice in how to respond. We could have imposed counter tariffs, which would have hurt our own consumers, or we could be more precise. We could identify the American companies most dependent on our regulatory permission and withdraw that permission. We chose precision." He paused. "Then, your tariffs chose our targets for us." The room was silent. Within 9 minutes, those 7 words were trending globally. Within an hour, they were the headline of every major financial newspaper. The Financial Times ran it above the fold. Bloomberg called it the most consequential sentence in international commerce since the end of fixed exchange rates. Carney had not just announced a ban. He had articulated a doctrine, Every tariff the United States imposes on an allied nation is an invitation for that nation to review every American company operating within its borders on the basis of government-granted permissions, spectrum licenses, data authorizations, operating permits, banking licenses, pharmaceutical approvals. Every single one of those permissions exists at the pleasure of the host government, and every single one can be reassessed when the relationship between that government and the United States changes. The paradox that neither Trump nor Musk considered is now clear. Trump's tariffs were designed to inflict economic pain so that allied economies would negotiate on American terms. But the theory assumed allied retaliation would follow the same playbook. Counter tariffs on American goods, which would hurt allied consumers and create domestic pressure to settle. The theory never accounted for the possibility that allies would skip the tariff playbook entirely and move to a different weapon, one cheaper, more precise, and more devastating to the American side. Musk, meanwhile, aligned himself with the administration because he believed political proximity would protect his business. Instead, it made his company the most politically satisfying target available. When those countries decided to retaliate against the administration's agenda, Musk's face was the first one they saw. Political proximity did not fail to protect Starlink.